Well, hey everybody, welcome to the Mudpie podcast. Today, we're going to be talking with Joshua Cutchin about his book, A Trojan Feast. And it's about the food and drink offerings of aliens, fairies, and Sasquatch. So before we get too far into it, Josh, if you want to just tell them a little bit about yourself and how you got started kind of researching into this book.
Yeah, certainly. So I always grew up a monster kid. I was really into monsters, not necessarily the unexplained stuff or like the true life stuff, but just monsters in general. And around, I guess this probably would have been, I guess it probably would have been Christmas of 2013. I got an Amazon gift card and decided to buy some books on Sasquatch, just to sort of feed that interest of mine for the first time in forever, because, I used to check out books at the local library or the school library or that sort of thing. And I bought a book that I'd heard some good things about, which I will say that, yes, it is a good book. J. Robert Alley's Raincoat Sasquatch. And it really is a lovely book, but something stuck out to me at one point, which was that amongst certain tribes, it was considered taboo or bad luck to accept food from the bookwus. This is tribes of the sort of southern coast of Alaska. And if you took food from the bookwus, which was their sort of Bigfoot analog, you would be trapped with the Bigfoot forever. And that that sort of lit a little light bulb in my head, because I recalled distinctly how that was something that you were never supposed to do if you ever went to Fairyland. And the folklore of Western Europe is if you went to Fairyland and you accepted the food, then you would be trapped, in Fairyland forever. So I said, well, that's really interesting. Maybe somebody will write a book about that someday. And I sort of waited a couple of months, and I'm like, okay, any day now, somebody should write a book on that. And I'm like, oh, wait, me,
You.
So I ended up just on faith and speculation writing it, and caught the attention of some people who really helped me get it in front of the right people, and it sort of had a snowball effect. And here we are, hard to believe, 5.5 years later. Yeah. And I've written 3 books and co-authored a book on Bigfoot with my co-author Timothy Renner, and got the second volume of that coming out. So it's turned into its own little mini career. Although I wouldn't advise anybody to take this career route. It is its own mini career, yeah.
Right on.
So where were you getting, when you first started, where did you start finding like the stories and encounters? Because I know in the book there's a lot of like paragraph encounters, and this happened here and this happened here. It's like super specific.
That's a really good question, especially for that first book. I mean, I sort of have a process now for how I write books, but it was definitely one of those things where it was like, I don't even know where to begin. I was at the time working at the University of Georgia. So I had access to the libraries and interlibrary loan and all that sort of thing. And that was super helpful. Just to be able to not only look at books on mythology about the role of food and drink, but also to be able to get some stuff through interlibrary loan that really is out of print. There's plenty of UFO books that have come and gone, and if you try to get a copy of them online, you're either looking to pirate one, which has its ethical questions, or you're going to be spending hundreds of dollars. And honestly, to be completely honest, very rarely in some of these cases is there a freely available PDF of this stuff. You kind of got to get the original hard copies. So I had all that available to me. I had a couple of books on things here and there, but my real document that I really dove into were the collected databases of Albert Rosales, his humanoid database that he had collected and had online. Albert has since, unfortunately, taken them down. I feel really lucky that I saved them before he took them down. He got tired of people, understandably, just reposting his stuff verbatim. So he's been collecting them in books themselves, but I have kept them for myself and don't really share them or anything. So I continue to use those as a resource. But what's interesting about that is Albert is pretty good with citing his sources, and that was something that I was really keen on doing when I entered this field, was making sure that I was diligent about having sources. Basically what it amounts to, I mean, I have 2 master's degrees, so I'm kind of in that sort of mindset of like citing your stuff and whatnot. Yeah. But basically, when you start citing your sources and you're writing about Bigfoot and UFOs and stuff, it's kind of like being the skinniest kid at fat camp. You know what I mean? It's like you've done something to show your work. But it really has been a blessing to be able to say, if you see something, I rarely make any claims in any of my books. It's most of the time it's me saying this comes from here, and if you want to come to a different conclusion, whatever, but this is exactly where I got it, and it's sort of an insurance against things going awry in the future. So anyway, certain names of certain things came along through looking at Albert's stuff, and then from there, I will say there is a lot of stuff that's available online. It's amazing. It's sort of gotten a little bit more difficult now, but it's amazing what you can do with just a couple of really good key search terms and something like Google Books, or the Look Inside feature on Amazon, because there are plenty of books in my bibliography that I do not own, and the reason I don't own them is because I needed them for a sentence. So I found I sort of found the best way. I'm going to sign out of this Google account and log in over here so it doesn't realize that I've looked at this. So you sort of end up with a process flow that way. Yeah,
that's awesome. I do like that about your book. All like the sightings and stuff, because there's a couple of them where I was reading and I was just like, man, I'd like to know more about this one particular instance, and just being able to like go back, like almost a quarter of the book is your reference material, or like where you got that stuff from.
Sometimes I feel like it's gotten to be a little bit of a problem. I wish I had one at hand. I don't, but I think my last book, the full last 150 pages is just in notes and bibliography and stuff. But again, a part of me says it's kind of a waste. At the same time, so few people are really being diligent about this, and there's so much silliness and garbage out there that I think it's important to say where you got stuff from. So.
Yeah, no, I think it's good, because I mean, the people that don't want to see it, they're not going to look, but people like me that like to nerd out on that stuff, like, it's perfect. I love to go back there and see that stuff. So,
well, yeah, I mean, especially nowadays when you kind of have to see where people are getting their information. It's kind of important nowadays, especially nowadays.
Well, and it's interesting too, because I mean, I've had some people approach me about my, people who are writing fiction about fairy, because for whatever reason, I don't know why, we can maybe go into it at some point, but like that Western European fairy folk tradition has really always resonated with me. And I've had some people who are writing their own fairy folk horror stuff, and they come to me like, what book should I look into? What should I read? And I'm like, just go through the bibliography in my last book, Thieves in the Night. Because it's all in there, and it's all pretty much good stuff. So it's also the number of people that I've had say, not only do I enjoy being able to read your book, but also being able to follow through on a thread that I find particularly interesting is just really helpful. So yeah, people have been really kind about that.
Good. Now, when you're talking about fairies, just for some people that might not, because I think that especially in our culture today, when you say fairy, people think Tinkerbell. They think like these. Like when people floating around like
these
wings,
little people,
yeah. That sort of impression that we have of fairies as being little sexy ladies at the bottom of the garden flying around with their wings and whatnot. That's kind of a 18th century children's storybook affectation. Fairies were always given the power of flight and levitation, but it wasn't until a lot of Shakespearean writing started coming along that you started seeing, stage plays with them having wings, and that sort of snowballed into children's literature as well. For the longest time, fairies were just considered spirits of the land. It's hard to really put a pin on exactly what they were, because there's a lot of conflation between, the dead and sort of pagan deities of place and nature spirits. But generally speaking, one of those several different things are what people in Western Europe believe that they are. Belief in fairies of one sort or another is really spread across every single continent. Sometimes they are conflated with other things like ancestors, but the idea that there are short beings that are able to travel in, these non-physical ways, and they have powers of magic attached to them, and that they have an affinity for stealing children, and that they typically live underground, that is shared by people on every inhabited continent. And what's really striking is to compare, old world fairy folklore and new world fairy folklore, because there are some really amazing connections there. But having said that, there's not a lot of hard and fast stuff about fairies. You'll find plenty of descriptions of fairies as being tall or human-sized. When you sort of take a step back and you realize that a lot of fairies would also be cataloged alongside things like giants and ogres and trolls, and you start to say, well, it's not just a size thing. And some of them, live in trees. Some of them, live, under the hill. But generally speaking, you can sort of say that fairies in folklore are powerful, mischievous, tend to live underground, tend to be short, and do have a fondness for abducting people, especially children. It's gotten to the point for me in my research. I'm very much a student of the field work that was pioneered by Jacques Vallée in his book Passport to Magonia, where he points out the similarities between fairies and aliens. I'm at the point right now where I can't and really don't distinguish between the two. The number of alien contact experiences that are seen in direct conjunction with something that we would call like a craft or something, not quite as strong a correlation as a lot of people would have you think. But the thing about it is that, I've been doing this for a little while now, and I have yet to find something that is a facet of one that is not mirrored in the other, meaning fairy folklore and the alien contact experience. Even down to things like implants and, the modern alien abduction experience, I can find analogs for in fairy folklore. It really is that striking. So I kind of tend to call them phalians now. That's sort of where I wound up with that. Yeah.
Now, do you think that, because I've heard a lot too about the similarities between the two, and maybe fairies just being used, all these words being used just to describe like general multidimensional beings and stuff like that. But when you're talking about these fairies, the one thing that seems different to me than the alien or Bigfoot, Sasquatch, any of that stuff, is the mischievous part, like that attitude, that causing trouble for fun, or like having this like weird sense of humor about the way that they behave, seems to be a little bit different. But do you ever find that in like alien references too?
I mean, yeah, there is the tendency that's, again, pretty under discussed, but there is a tendency for abductees to experience lingering poltergeist phenomena in their homes. And poltergeist phenomena, by its very nature, kind of has that sort of puckish or impish sort of misplacing of objects and misplacing of keys. There's also a strong through line of synchronicity, and almost ironic synchronicity, in the lives of a lot of alien abductees. Synchronicity doesn't explicitly feature being named as such in fairy folklore, because that term was, pretty much a term that was coined by Carl Jung. But there is also that sort of playful quality that you find in the lives of some abductees. One of my favorite examples of how that sort of manifests itself in the Bigfoot phenomena is there's a case that I mentioned in volume 1, and well, actually volumes 1 and 2 of my Bigfoot book with Timothy Renner, Where the Footprints End, about the Rochdale Bigfoot of Rochdale, Indiana. And it was seen regularly around the same time that people were seeing UFOs in the same area. It would seem to travel through thick brush without making a sound, and moved as if there were no impediments there, wouldn't leave any footprints in the mud. And at the same time, again, the primary witnesses in this case, it was seen by the whole community, but the primary witnesses started having poltergeist phenomena in their homes. And one of the things that happened was the sudden appearance of a little toy flying saucer that no one knew where it came from. So there is sort of like a, I mean, it's not mischievous as much in the same way that, the fairy folk would like poke out your eye or something, but it does sort of have that quality. But as far as things like, observing the fairies and being punished for it, that was a very common thing. If you happen to see the fairy ladies bathing, you might, be blinded, or, if you stopped and didn't acknowledge a fairy woman, she might touch you on your head and you'd lose your hair. It takes little imagination to sort of reimagine some of those things in the context of what we would qualify as radiation seen in UFOs, UFO cases. Oh, I saw the UFO and now I've got temporary blindness or my hair falling out. That's a very, very similar thing. So it's not always a direct one-to-one correlation, but in terms of the way that these things express themselves on sort of a, you sound kind of hotsy snotsy saying it, but on a mythopoetic sort of level, that sort of broader scale level is pretty consistent. And I find it kind of elegant in that way, because to me, it really suggests that we're tapping into something that is, for me, more interesting than the idea that we're being visited by, little green scientists from another planet. I mean, I don't want to say that sounds pedestrian, but it kind of does, in the sense that there isn't a deeper, more philosophical meaning to it. And I think that if you're talking about UFOs and aliens, at the bar after the conference, and you don't end up talking about, things like God and the meaning of life and things like that, you might want to sort of reevaluate who you're having the conversation with, because that's where a lot of this stuff tends to lean up.
Yeah. Oh, we're gonna get along just fine, because I agree with that.
Good.
Now, I know I'm kind of straying from your book, but I promise I'll get back to it. But
fine.
As far as like modern day stuff, are we still across? I mean, I know in America, at least, it's dominated by UFOs and Sasquatch, at least from mainstream, or what the majority of the, like, reports are. But worldwide, and even here, are we still getting reports of like fairies in the form of, they're at least using the same vernacular to describe the fairy as they would have 100 years ago, 200 years ago?
You'd be surprised. You kind of find that modern descriptions of things that are literally sounding just like fairies today. The confounding thing is that they can conform to that children's book image, which some people would say, well, that means that, obviously somebody's making it up, or, this isn't the same phenomena. But for me, I really do think that a lot of these paranormal topics are coming from the same source, but they're drawing upon our cultural stereotypes, our cultural images, to sort of rebuild themselves. Almost like a positive version of Lovecraft, in all those Lovecraft stories, you see something and your mind can't wrap its head around what it's, it can't figure out what you're seeing. This is almost like,
it's almost like the culture creates a visual.
Yeah, or like, Ghostbusters, choose the form of your destructor, sort of thing. But, having said that, I would say that there's a little bit stronger tendency to at least recognize a lot of these things as fairy folk in the British Isles. Simon Young from the Fairy Investigation Society, which, yes, is a thing that still exists, collects a fairy census that they put out several years from time to time, and believe they just released one a year or two ago. If you just do a Google search for fairy census, just like the U.S. census, CENSUS, you'll find that document, and it's just got it's got cases that are lined up with motifs and how they express themselves. So, yeah, you do find that. But again, it's which is. For somebody who's really interested in the fairy lore, it always sort of gets to me a little bit, irritates me a little bit when people are saying, well, we're talking about extraterrestrials, we're not talking about leprechauns. And I'm like, but actually,
It might be.
Yeah.
Do you think people just don't like the term fairy in modern culture? Like, they just don't take it, I don't know, because I feel like when I talk to people,
it's kind of been co-opted. Yeah, it's kind of been co-opted. I mean, I was in Ireland in 2017, and I remember speaking with someone, and even granted, by and large, they have a much healthier respect for these topics than a lot of us do here in America. But even someone there was talking to was like, you're this 6'4", big, broad, 33-year-old guy at the time. How could you possibly be interested in fairies? And people don't realize that it's really part and parcel of the same soup that we would be talking about, like, elemental spirits, or, again, spirits of the dead. It really all seems to be the sort of the same soup. I really like it because there is, I think, when you start talking about the fairies in that true deep folkloric sense, you start hinting at how kind of beyond understanding this is. There's a real, not to get too sort of political or postmodern, but there is a real imperialist, colonialist kind of urge to this idea that, like, we're going to capture Bigfoot and we're going to mount it and put it on a wall.
Yeah.
And similarly, I think that, thinking that we're ever going to have proof of aliens in the form of, like, crashed memory metal or something, also really it kind of stems from the same place, as opposed to looking at a lot of these indigenous peoples who are saying that these are part of a cosmology that we just have lost touch with, lost interaction with in the modern day West. It's kind of like one of those things where you'll have, Bigfoot's been on my mind lately, so I'll use that as an example, but you'll have, indigenous people say, oh, Bigfoot has the ability to disappear. And you'll have, the cryptozoologists come along and be like, well, that must mean that Bigfoot is very good at running away and running up trees. And you're like, no, these people knew the forest better than you ever will.
Mm-hmm.
When they said it disappeared, If you keep with that sort of line of thinking, you wind up saying, oh, well, Bigfoot's just a bear, because you keep on trying to fit it back into the box of what you know it to be.
Yeah.
So I encourage people to always sort of go into that, to sort of try to rewire their mind into thinking in terms of those boxes that we don't feel comfortable putting things in. That's a really long roundabout way of answering your question. But
I'm into it. Like, we had a guest on who was talking about Bigfoot a lot, but more on, like, the scientific side of it. And I was
first episode.
Yeah. And I was like, I've heard and read a lot of stories about Bigfoot encounters where, yeah, like you say, they just vanish, or they're near like some energy portal and they're able to, like, dimensionally cross, and that's how come you can't find them. And that's how they don't leave a bunch of tracks, because they can legitimately, like, go into a different layer of reality or something like that. So to connect the two to fairies, for me, is not, I mean, not an issue at all.
And the Bigfoot thing does bring up an interesting point, which is the fact that, again, it's just the Western way of thinking, where we say, well, of course, Bigfoot's got to be a flesh and blood creature because it leaves behind tracks in some cases, even though there are plenty of trackways that end and tracks that are weird and stuff like that. It leaves behind tracks. We find blood. We find Bigfoot poop. We find Bigfoot hair. It's got to be, a physical creature. And what a lot of people who say that don't realize is that that's really a false dichotomy that we've overlaid on the world, this physical, non-physical, material, non-material sort of idea. One of the first ways that people started using tools in ghost hunting was spreading talcum powder on the floor to get ghosts to leave footprints. So if a ghost can leave a footprint, then certainly, So we can't say that Bigfoot has to be, a flesh and blood creature because it leaves footprints. It really, between that and how replicable psi phenomena has become in the laboratories these days, I think that we have to sort of realize that things that are non-physical can have a physical impact on our world. And I know I'm probably getting out there a little bit woo for a lot of people, but
bring it on, dude. I'm about to
that's
say,
that's what this show is all about.
What gets me too is that half these people that can't accept that there is possibly this other level or this other layer of stuff are also people that have no issues believing in God, and that deity manifested himself and came here in some aspect, and that's fine, but there's no way that it could be this thing.
Yeah, it's funny that I have a good friend, Adam Sane, over at the Conspiranormal podcast, and he sort of flipped it the other way. He said, I believe in all this crazy weird stuff. Why can't I believe in Jesus? Yeah. But you can flip the other way, right? You can be like, well, the Bible is like, it's always so funny when, like, ultra conservative Christians are against, like, magic and against the supernatural. The Bible's like the most magical supernatural book that's ever existed.
Of magic, even some of their heroes have magical abilities.
So it's really easy to make that paradigmatic flip, and even for the people, I mean, but you can, I'm in the position where I can sort of talk even some staunch atheists into accepting the idea that there are things that, because that's always the thing. Well, if it can't be measured, it doesn't exist. But
That's not true.
if I talk to an atheist about how much they love their cat, well, you don't really love your cat because I can't measure how much you love your cat. It's like, yeah, come on. Yeah. So yeah, it's you sort of Goldilocks your way into that sort of woo camp, and the trick is to keep it at enough of an arm's length so that you don't go completely off the deep end, I think.
Sure.
Yeah.
And so
Plus, it's fun to
you
just learn about it.
you say that there's people that actually report being abducted
by
fairies.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that, in the contemporary sense, that people tend to qualify these more as alien abductions.
Okay.
Any alien abduction that doesn't take place in the presence of a craft is suspect. I think that all alien abductions are suspect in that term. I guess what I'm getting at is that I think that the alien abduction stories and the fairy folklore are describing the same thing, but I don't think that fairies are aliens or that aliens are fairies. I don't think that any real body of quote unquote belief or any body of stories or honestly living folklore in terms of the abduction experience, I don't think either one is accurately describing what's actually going on, but I think they're both talking about the similar phenomena in similar ways.
Gotcha.
Having said that, you do find examples of especially younger children describing sort of gnome-like or fairy-like creatures taking them. I think it's really interesting that if you take a look at all the warnings that people, again, I tend to focus on Western Europe because the folklore of the British Isles is especially robust. But if you look at a lot of those warnings in a lot of these older texts about like how to avoid being abducted by fairies, a lot of the things that people do in the missing 411, suite of disappearances are the exact opposite. It's like, I think Paulinus mentioned, people disappear near streams and boulder fields. Well, guess where fairies most likely to live is in, alongside, bodies of water and in boulder fields. People disappear with bright colored clothing. Bright colored clothing would offend the fairies. People disappear around, while berry picking. That was one of the most dangerous things that you could do in the folklore of Ireland, go berry picking by yourself or berry picking without a piece of stale bread in your pocket to ward away the fairies. So, I think that a lot of these different topics are describing something that's very real, that's interacting with us. But I don't think that any one of them has a really good grasp on exactly what is going on. Another thing you've got to be careful with is a lot of this older body of belief, tended to throw around the word fairy like we throw around the word paranormal or supernatural. It was just sort of the vernacular of the day.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so getting back to the book a little bit. There's this idea that, well, not this idea, that's what's written and reported in the stories and stuff about food and drink offerings from these different entities or beings in order to almost manipulate people in some way or another. So can we maybe start like one of the older stories, maybe one of the oldest stories that you came upon where they first started talking about offering of food or drink?
Yeah. Well, so there tend to be these stories that you'll find throughout a variety of different cultures, and a pretty widespread belief that to travel to, let's call it the other world, which is a stand-in for the afterlife, for fairyland, for, in the case of the modern, alien abductee phenomena, the spaceship, the other world, whatever that other place is. If you go there and you break bread with the people and you eat with them, you're sort of associating with them and you're stuck there forever. So in terms of like amongst the oldest stories that you'll find, one of them is the myth of Persephone, who was taken to the underworld and given a cursed pomegranate seed that she consumed, and she was destined to remain in the underworld forever. And a lot of folklorists will point to that as the main reason that this belief, this folk belief, this food taboo, as I call it, has proliferated around the world. And I buy that in the case of Eurasia. But when you look at the fact that that same story has analogs in Polynesia and in Oceania and island Southeast Asia and the New World, you have to go, well, okay, so one of three things has to be going on here if the story began with Persephone. Either, and none of these three options are ever really palatable to the establishment. Either, yes, it all is a derivation of this Persephone myth, and that's where everybody came up with this idea that if you eat cursed food, you're trapped in the other world forever. But if that's the case, that means that we had much more cross-pollination of cultures at a global level than we currently understand. Mm-hmm. Or two, you have to say that the Jungian collective unconscious is a real thing, and it's a lot more profound and a lot more specific than we've given it credit for. Or three, and my personal favorite, is that no, there actually is an objective reality to this that is shared independently amongst cultures across the globe that shouldn't have had any contact with each other. It's always my personal favorite. But you'll find the story, like I said, you'll find it in Scandinavia with there's a Finnish set of folk tales that talks about him being given a tankard of beer and not finishing it. And you'll find similar stories throughout the British Isles. And it's one of those things where part of the reason that it's ill-advised to eat the food and drink is because you'll be stuck there, because it actually is not food or drink. It tends to be some sort of detritus, twigs, leaves, worms, etc., that's cloaked with this sort of fairy glamour to make it appear appealing. There was a story of a 7th century Welsh Saint Colin, who visited the king of the fairies and was given some food and said that they were the leaves of the tree. He was able to see through the glamour, and he ended up, saying that he wouldn't dine with the fairies. So yeah, these stories are, I suspect that you would find similar stories that really stretch into antiquity in that part of the world as well. But once you start seeing these things appearing in these sort of ancient old world epics, then you're like, well, they're basically timeless. Yeah.
Yeah. That's awesome. And it's fascinating too, because I'm with you. I think all three of those options you said are totally believable, because I'm a fan of ancient archaeology, right? So the idea that we have structures across the world around the same time frame that just popped up super similar,
Yeah, and I've thought about it, and like if you can think of another option that could explain this, be my guest. But I feel like it has to be one of those three, like either global civilization, either mankind taps into archetypes in a very real way, or there's something objectively going on here. Yeah.
Well, hopefully one day we'd find out. That would be awesome. Or at least I could have a personal experience to where I could be surely convinced of what I saw.
Yeah. Are you? So you're sort of like me in that you're more or less paranormal kryptonite.
Yeah. I just want
a lot of maybes. Yeah. A lot of maybe experiences. Yeah. So that's kind of.
And I'm like, man, I'm so open to it. I'm open-minded about the whole thing. It would just be great to wake up in a spaceship one day. Go ahead. Drill my eye out. I don't care. At least I know it's happening.
Exactly.
So across culture now, do you think that's also, it's kind of a sidetrack, but do you think this is also related to this Adam and Eve story in biblical things, as far as like, okay, serpent gave this person a piece of fruit, and now they're not necessarily stuck where they are, but they're cast out of where they are, stuck in this new type of condition?
Yeah, that's the funny thing that I've learned when writing a lot of these books that are on sort of like one topic, is that you start talking about the one thing and then you're like, oh no, it starts to sort of fall apart like an overripe onion, and you're like, it's got all these different layers, and that definitely is one of them. In a lot of different myths and cultures that consume entheogens, psychedelics, which sort of supposedly allow you to commune with the inner God. A lot of these are literally exactly what we're talking about, gifts from a non-human entity that's come down and used them as a way to commune with the spirit world. And if you look at certain lines of I guess heretical teaching, there are some people that say that they do feel that the apple from the tree of knowledge was actually perhaps a psilocybin mushroom, or mescaria, some sort of psychedelically active mushroom.
I could totally see that, by the way.
Well, it makes a lot of sense, doesn't it?
Yeah,
In terms
sure
of
does.
having that sort of awareness that you're not supposed to have, and there's some circumstantial stuff that people really love to point to. I think there's a mural in a church in France that I mentioned where the tree of knowledge explicitly is a mushroom, and outside of it's it's sort of a modern, very Anglican thing that we think of toads and toadstools together throughout most parts of the country, or the world rather. There's more of an association with serpents and mushrooms. So, it makes sense. And then you've got all this serpent imagery that happens in a lot of these people who have, take drugs and have trips. I wouldn't necessarily characterize the ayahuasca experience as a trip because it sounds pretty rotten from everything I've heard. But Mother Ayahuasca is envisioned as a serpent. You have this association with comets and serpents. You have lake monsters and, Nessie and whatnot being sort of like serpents. And you have, this line of thinking that there are reptilian aliens visiting Earth in a serpentine fashion. So it's a recurring motif throughout all these topics that is, again, really compelling. I do think that I'm trying to think of a good way to put this that is sort of true to my intellectual truths and my spiritual truths, because I am a practicing Christian. I would think that if there is a literal analog to the Adam and Eve story, that it probably does not involve an apple. I guess probably the safest way I could put it. Yeah.
I'm from that camp. I believe it's stoned ape all the way. I think that.
I have such a love for Terrence McKenna and all this stuff. And the stoned ape hypothesis really does have a nice tidiness to it, and I always the way I always tell people my one hurdle that I can't get over, and this is kind of unfair, but it's true, is that I buy him saying that.
That's pretty good.
Thanks. It's the transcendental object at the end of time. I buy him saying A to B, and I buy him saying B to C, and I buy him saying C to D. But when I zoom back and I view A to D, I'm always like, I don't know if I can quite endorse that connection. But but it's certainly been yet to be falsified, in my opinion. That's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it is a big leap. It is one of the few possibilities that I think it's one of my favorite few possibilities. It's like in my top 3 or 4 for sure. Now, I was curious. I didn't see a lot of information as to why staying, or at least I might have been concentrating on something else when I was reading to where I read, but what is the negative to getting stuck in a fairy world? Because, I mean, it kind of seems like it would be interesting to be a part of that.
That's a really good question. I was actually kind of wondering the same thing.
Well, so... And yeah, that is a good question, and of course, there's a giant sort of hole in this collection of what my book is about. So the book is sort of about the way that these sort of food taboos have continued to manifest themselves through the modern contact experience, and obviously, we never hear about the people who take the food and stay. It's like those stories about missing 411 people not missing 411 people, but the people who are eaten by Bigfoot or whatever, like they never return. You're never going to hear about it. So there's sort of a logical flaw in that. There are some stories where you would accept food. For example, I think it was in Denmark, the Ellemaids, which were, again, a fairy folk variation, would stop a young knight on his way back to the castle and have him drink some wine with them, and he was sort of driven mad and always wanted to return back to them. So he couldn't go home in that sense. There are other stories that I believe I wrote about in the book. If not, it was a real missed opportunity. Of some people in some indigenous cultures who were given food in the other world, and they were actually able to return back to their village, but they weren't able to talk to anybody, right? So obviously, you're cut off from your family, your tribe, etc. But I think a lot of the concerns about that are sort of mired in a lot of Christian or early church reimaginations of the world of fairyland. So The other world in Celtic mythology is not exactly fairyland, and it's not exactly the afterlife. They're kind of conflated, and sometimes it is one and it's not, and sometimes it's the other one and it's not. There is a fragmentary poem that exists called "The Queen of Elfin's Nurse," where there's there are three roads described when you die: one to heaven, one to hell, and one to fairyland. And sort of you start to see this sort of Christianization of fairyland as sort of a purgatory. So if you're, an early Christian, you certainly wouldn't want to get stuck in purgatory forever. Moreover, there's sort of a thought that if you were, to be taken or away with the fairies, this ties into some changeling phenomena or some changeling belief as well, that, your body might appear dead, but your soul was away with the fairies. So that, it was almost like a bad death, and you actually wouldn't get resurrected upon Christ's resurrection because you were sort of stuck in fairyland. You were stuck in this, it's like a limbo or purgatory that you couldn't escape ever, more or less. There is some indication in a lot of these older stories that was the case. Typically the way that a lot of these story beats tend to unfold is that someone stumbles into or happens upon a fairy party, either, under the hill or in a field or something, and they're about to take a sip of punch or about to eat something, and someone that they recognize from their village who has passed away several years ago says, "Oh no, don't do this because you'll be trapped here forever like I was." So, I guess it's kind of similar to what you're talking about earlier with just go ahead and take me. Like there's some people who would love to be taken, but if you're part of that sort of that early Christian mindset, it would be pretty terrifying to not be
you'd be just so
taken up at the rapture or whatever.
Sure.
That's a hard one, because when I think about it, I think I'm just curiosity kills the cat every time, and I'd be like, I just can't help it. I want to try this out a little bit and see what it's all about.
Well, I'm at the point now, and of course all my friends are like, well, some 5 grams of grams in silent darkness will take you there.
It'll get you pretty close, my friend.
Yeah, I know, and I still haven't done it. I still haven't done it yet. But yeah, I'm. Yeah, what was that?
That's probably the closest, or when I first started really being more accepting of different layers of reality and possibly different entities, is because of psilocybin mushrooms. Probably the most complete individual experience of my life, and it kind of changes everything. And then you're just like, wow, all this stuff could be, because you're in this, it's just like a weird world that you seem to be in. It's just a strange.
Oh yeah, it totally seems like a different place. It's a completely different place in my mind.
For me, I think my biggest hurdling block is that I want to do it and have trained medical staff on hand in case case something happens with me, because I don't trust my health quite enough. You know what I mean? Or even my mental health quite enough. I want somebody to be. I want this. I guess what I'm saying is I want the setting part of set and setting to be
absolutely.
So
when I did
the most important part.
When I did it, my wife was right there, and she's a nurse. And that just made my experience, it just made me feel a whole lot more comfortable. And like you said, set and setting, it just made my experience so much better.
I bet. Well, one of the things that people don't talk about too much is in the Rick Strassman DMT studies, if memory serves, there were some people whose blood pressure shot up so high that they sort of went to a hypertensive emergency. So with me, that's what's going on in my mind. And that's the last thing that I need going through my mind when I take mushrooms, right?
Because that's not a short trip.
It's a journey.
Hours.
It's like 8 or 12 hour half-life.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. So out of all the stories that you researched and the accounts that you researched, was there one that just really kind of stuck in your mind that you felt was the strongest candidate for any type of evidence for this, or the one that you just can't seem to shake?
Well, it's interesting. There is, in terms of people who are contactees or abductees being given food and being explicitly told that it'll keep you trapped there forever, well, there are only a handful of cases that are like that. Oftentimes these foods or liquids are administered for some sort of medical purpose, or for the reasons of sort of giving people some sort of forced amnesia. But one of the cases that I can't seem to shake, which is a good way of putting it, that has really stuck with me is one of the cases that was described by Credo Mutua. Plenty of caveats with this and plenty of setup for this, so I'll go ahead and do that. Yeah. So in a lot of these cases where you have these entheogens in a lot of these cultures, they are deemed being sort of a part of the god, the semen of the god in the case of certain, ayahuasca or yage cults. Cults is the wrong word, but beliefs. We see this in a lot of cultures, a lot of ancient cultures, and a lot of ancient religions, and we see it in modern Christianity. The idea of communion is basically the same idea. So you have this motif of eating the god, and you have this motif of this motif of there being a similarity between these stories of beings coming down and giving humans some sort of entheogenic food. And there is I won't even say abductee, because his interactions had such sort of a contactee sort of flavor to them. There was a South African contactee that was studied at length by John Mack, the late great John Mack, alien abduction researcher, named Credo Mutua, who has since passed away. It's interesting because a lot of Credo Mutua's stories don't fall into that sort of modernized alien abduction trope where people are taken out of their bed at night by a bright light and they're prodded and poked. He has some things that are sort of suggestive of that, but a lot of his stories read a little bit more like not only the contactee stories of the 50s and 60s, but also sort of just folk tales almost. And he claimed that he had eaten part of an alien, which I know sounds like the goofiest thing ever. But so he spoke. He framed he framed the entities, the Greys, in the context of his Zulu upbringing. He grew up a Zulu shaman and Christian family, and he referred to them as the Mantindane, which are sort of like South African Zulu familiars, witches familiars, and they would have this body of belief around them, these Mantindane, that they would take people into the sky and they would traumatize them and torture them and impregnate women. So basically the same sort of suite of things that you see with the abduction experience. And he claimed in a magazine in the late 90s that he had actually been able to eat a gray alien. He had a friend in Lesotho who had given him this like dry, gray, flaky bit of flesh. And he said, no, this is the flesh of a Mantindane. And the reason that this is interesting is that they broke out in hives after eating this, their tongue swelled, but they basically like tripped for, I think it was a couple of different weeks, like, or even maybe it was months, where they said that like water tasted like wine and they saw colors that they had never described, and they would just have these laughing fits for a gigantic amount of time. Now, look, did that really happen? I don't know. And to some extent, I really don't care. What I find interesting is that there is the number of motifs that you can unpack from that. The eating of the god, the entheogen, the idea that the god's flesh somehow gives you powers to see into the realm of the gods, all tied up with this alien abduction, witches familiar sort of bow, really does hit me as an example of what I find most interesting. For me, it's never the validity of any individual story. It's how this story, from someone who probably has no background in this, is able to pick up this bit of folklore from this part of the world and incorporate it, or this other things that they should never have any real, it's the consistency rather than the veracity of any given account that I find really, really compelling. And that's one of them. But not only because it's interesting, but it's also so, batshit insane. But it's just one of my favorite stories. It's one of my favorite stories. Yeah.
Sorry, that's nuts. And that goes back to what we were saying about the three options. One is that this thing is really happening. That's the only way to have this shared knowledge. Like, I don't see how that's unreasonable at all. And there's so many instances of that across all different subjects, you know?
Yeah, it's really interesting to see, you know, there are a couple of cases in the book that I talk about that were none of, don't ask me to list any of them right off the top of my head, but there's an interesting phenomena where as soon as the Iron Curtain fell, a lot of these these contact stories started to come out, and you saw consistency in those stories with stuff that was happening, you know, elsewhere in the world where they supposedly weren't supposed to have as much contact. To say nothing of the fact that I don't think, you know, a potato farmer from Novosibirsk is reading up on the folklore of, you know, the Witoto. You know, it's just these things really shouldn't, people shouldn't have some of the knowledge that they have, is sort of what it comes down to.
Yeah. Now, what were the differences in because I know there were some in when using to describe fairies, they generally offered one type of food or drink, and then, you know, Sasquatch might offer in general like one type of thing. That people that reported aliens kind of reported one thing. What were those main differences, and what do you count that to?
Well, you know, so I included Sasquatch in this book because of some of that surrounding folklore about, you know, being receiving food from the Bookwus and being trapped there forever. But a lot of the food that you get in stories of people who are given food by Sasquatch tend to be things like plants and meat. It is interesting that there's a lot of consistency. I mean, not surprising to me, but interesting that there's a lot of consistency between the sort of foods that were offered by fairies and that are offered by aliens. I mean, liquid is the number one thing. You've also sort of got to look at the way these things recontextualize themselves. If I were traveling down the road in, you know, 19th century County Limerick, and I gave someone a pill, they might think it was a wafer, you know, so when you read these stories of people receiving fairy bread or fairy loaves, you have to kind of go, well, maybe is that what they're describing in that case? So, you know, there is a consistency for bread to be offered as well. And then fruits and vegetables are sort of a third, if memory serves. But there is a tendency for milk to be offered in a lot of these cases. And if not milk, obviously it was explicitly milk in a lot of these fairy stories, in addition to alcohol, which carries a different meaning at the time than it does today. Alcohol at the time was just considered the most sanitary way to hydrate because through the fermentation process, you actually ended up making a version of fluid to hydrate with that was more sanitary than most drinking water. But you know, even in modern you know, alien abductee stories, you do see these sort of thick, milky, sort of liquid sort of described a little bit more. And it's interesting that a lot of the foods that you see in a lot of these entity encounters do correspond to this idea of the sattvic diet, which is something that I didn't really know about. The sattvic diet is a lacto-vegetarian diet. What differentiates it from a just typical lacto-vegetarian diet is the emphasis that it places on certain foods as being the best or least, most spiritually hygienic. It's an Ayurvedic diet. It comes out of the Indian tradition. And if you sort of take a more or less, broadly speaking, if you take a survey of the sort of foods and drinks that people find in these alien and fairy stories and map their prominence against the best foods and drinks to consume in the sattvic diet model, you'll sort of find a pretty close correlation in terms of the emphasis placed on certain things. And what you certainly won't find is you will not find a proliferation of the foods that are in the other two Ayurvedic diets, the tamasic and rajasic foods. You will not find them in a lot of these contact encounters. And to make it even more interesting, in this particular discipline, the people who follow sattvic diets are more likely to have some degree of spiritual clarity as well. So there's obviously that spiritual dimension that always keeps on creeping in at the margins of the alien abduction contact experience. There's something about these experiences has a lot to do with consciousness. which is, again, another reason that I get irritated with the extraterrestrial hypothesis crowd, is because even if it's just aliens, it's really weird aliens. Like, it's like weird telekinetic, we can speak to you through your minds, and also here's your dead grandmother. You know, that's sort of, if it's aliens, it's aliens who can do that. At which point, why do we even need to be banging that extraterrestrial drum? Like, we're full on in, you know, magical weirdo spirit territory now, you know?
Right.
Yeah, I'm all for aliens, but I don't attribute magical powers to aliens. I mean, I'm from the camp, like, if you think it's a scientific creature from a technologically advanced civilization coming here, then that's what it is. Why do they have to read my mind? They just know how to fly through space. You know what I mean?
Well, and you know, there are different modalities of thinking that you can sort of use in there. I mean, like, an idea that I've been playing with lately too is, like, what if it's ghosts, but it's alien ghosts? You know, like, what if it's like, you know, there's a lot of different ways that you can take it.
I've never actually put much thought into alien ghosts. That's interesting.
Well, you know, what's interesting is that, you know, I don't know how much you know about the sort of the Stanford Research Institute stuff, the remote viewing experiments that they had and whatnot.
Hell yeah!
But there's a great story by oh man, I can never remember his name, and I'll have to put off the other guy. Ingo Swann, I believe, who was asked to remote view some coordinates that turned out being the moon, and there was like this moon base, which, you know, whatever. I firmly believe that remote viewing is real, because from what I've read, there have been some really intense, really very specific hits. Mm-hmm. Now, whether or not Ingo Swann saw people on the moon, I don't know, but he claimed that in his remote viewing session he did, and he claimed that these moon people saw him remote viewing somehow. And I've always sort of wondered, like, what if whenever we see a UFO, that's what we see in an alien civilization remote viewing us, you know, if that's how it manifests, as, you know, a light in the sky or something.
I'm with you. Did you read the CIA document about, because, you know, they used to run remote viewing tests, and they did ones for Mars and Jupiter, and they did a remote viewing. They brought this guy in to remote view coordinates on Mars. He didn't know the coordinates were on Mars, and so he, like, confirmed these objects like the obelisks and things like that. And this was like back in the 70s when they were first starting to receive images from Mars.
Nice.
They asked him to go back like 1 million years in time in his remote viewing, and he did it, and then had a full conversation with an entity that was from Mars 1 million years ago, and was able to communicate with the past entity. Well, according to the CIA document, like what he was saying. But
so I may have heard this at some point. I don't think I have, but, like, I love what that story, and I know it's a big if, folks, but but if that story is true, I love how much that just blows up our conception of what these little lights in the sky could be, or these entities could be, you know. Consciousness is completely decoupled from time and from a different planet. It gets just wonderfully elaborately weird, and I love it.
It's awesome. So what are you working on now, like these days?
So I wrote A Trojan Feast in 2015, and in 2016 I did the Brimstone Deceit, which is all about smells. In 2016, 2018 was Thieves in the Night, which is about paranormal child abduction. And then I crammed together very quickly. My dear friend Timothy Renner approached me and said, let's do sort of the definitive book on you know, Bigfoot and high strangeness, because, you know, while I'm here, you know, ruffling the feathers of people who think that UFOs are aliens, I might as well ruffle the feathers of people who think that Bigfoot's a giant primate. But there's a lot of weird stuff associated with Bigfoot. To the extent that I had no idea. We were just going to write a book together, but it quickly grew into 2 books. So volume 1 of Where the Footprints End was released in May of this past of 2020. And
where can you find it?
Amazon solely, actually, unfortunately. And if you want a signed copy, you can contact me. But if you want a signed copy of me, myself, and Timothy, you're going to have to do some postage kung fu or something, because he lives in Pennsylvania and I live in Georgia, so it's a little bit hard for us to get together, especially in a pandemic. But but it's been really well received. And volume 2, we're literally just waiting on the cover to be colorized, and it should be out very early 2021. I think it's a little bit ambitious to expect it out by Christmas. So early 2021 for Where the Footprints End volume 2. Volume 1 is out there right now. And then sometime early next year, I'm putting the finishing touches on a collection of essays about how fairy archetypes appear in film. Not just films that are explicitly about fairies, but also saying, this film XYZ actually is about fairy lore if you look at it through that lens. And then I'm working on another book that is exhausting and really intimidating to the extent that every couple of days I think about throwing in the towel on it. It's kind of my big theory of everything, and it's talking about the dead and burial mounds and ley lines and Nessie and aliens and fairies and psychopomps and ancestor worship, and it's way too big, and I don't know if anybody's going to be able to want to publish it, but yeah,
a 2,000-page book.
So. Yeah, it honestly feels that way. But it's going to be probably my most speculative thing, right, that I've ever put together. It's just one of those things where it's like, if I stand back and squint, I can kind of see how things fit together. So I'm trying to put that into in one place for me, if for nobody else. I think that's the secret of doing this stuff, is just write it for yourself, and if other people happen to like it, then that's just gravy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's
absolutely.
It. I'm glad you're writing it. I'm definitely going to get this Where the Footprint Ends, because I love talking Bigfoot. And
yeah, let's have another episode. Let's talk about Bigfoot.
Yeah, this is a great conversation. Yeah, I'd love to. And maybe we can have a real party line. We can get my co-author Timothy Renner on here, and we can do that.
Yeah,
sounds awesome.
That would be fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
All right, thanks, man. I appreciate this. This was great.
It was a lot of fun, guys. It was too short, but we'll catch up soon.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, this is happening. I'll shoot you an email here in the next day or so. We'll get something figured out.
Sounds good. All right, you guys have a great rest of the afternoon.
Yeah, you too. Thanks, Josh.
Bye, y'all.